Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of What We Missed in School, Educate and Inform. The last couple videos released focused on John Lewis and the lead up to the Civil War in the first half of the 19th century. Before we get into it, as far as Civil War goes, we're not going to be knocking off one episode. It's not possible. But I also know that it's important for us to kind of touch on, or important for my father to touch upon the founding of the Confederacy and how there was even an opposing side during the Civil War. So, Dad, you can hop into that.
Okay. I think that what you have to understand is that there were a series of events that I believe we covered last week that led up to the Civil War. And certainly one of the more important events, although not really discussed that much, was the beginning of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party really got started in Wisconsin around 1854. By 1856, ran as first person for president, John C. Fremont, who was defeated by James Buchanan, generally regarded as right now regarded as one of the two or three worst presidents in American history. And shortly after Buchanan was inaugurated, Jefferson Davis received a letter from someone, an anonymous letter, stating that it was good that Buchanan won now, but we had to be prepared for 4 years from now because they'll be back in full force. The reason to be is to end slavery, and we must be prepared for that. So when 1860 rolled around and Abraham Lincoln became the nominee for the Republican Party, the Democrats nominated Stephen, I forgot his last name. Oh my gosh. Hang on just a second.
Yeah, of course. All right.
Pause. Now remember.
Now you're ready.
We're all set.
Yep.
So the Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas as president and the little giant of Illinois politics. And so the thing about it here is that, of course, there were actually three Democrats who ran for president against Lincoln as the party really began to split up. And so with about 40% of the vote, Lincoln won the election. And he didn't even appear on the ballot in the South. So hence secession began with South Carolina becoming the first, and Mississippi was next, and then on, until finally the big one, Virginia, seceded in 1861. The thing here is that when the Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln refused to say that this was a war to end slavery. Instead, he publicly stated that this was a war to keep the Union together, that the South did not have the right to leave the Union. This was a contract. The South, of course, is arguing that, in fact, this was the reason why they're leaving is because of the fact that the North broke the contract. Now, Lincoln's goal certainly was to hold the Union together. I mean, that was his number one goal. And he was heavily criticized for not saying this was a war to end slavery. But Lincoln understood something. He understood this was a war to end slavery. He got that. But publicly, though, he refused to acknowledge that because of the fact he understood that Northerners may not like slavery, but they're not willing to go to war to end it. But to keep the Union together, they are willing to fight. So the genius of Lincoln was the ability to sort of read the tea leaves, if you will. He was, he may well be the most intelligent president in American history. And he was certainly a person who was the greatest political president in American history. And so, yet for all of his genius and his brilliance, Lincoln certainly had the ability to listen to other people, and that became important when 1862 rolled around. Now, during the first year of the war, the Confederacy pretty much dominated the battlefield, and both sides agreed that there's going to be a white man's war. Particularly Frederick Douglass, the black people in general, agitated to fight, but they were not allowed. Certainly, this is the case in the Confederacy as well, where there were calls to let slaves and free blacks fight for the Confederacy. But it was not something that was taken seriously overall, although the Confederate Congress did go ahead and allocate money to get blacks in the Confederate Army. And in fact, the last few days of the war, they did fight for the Confederacy. Lincoln himself probably would have paid out of his own pocket if he had the money to let blacks fight for the Confederacy. Interestingly enough, because this would have taken the racial tinge off the war. It would not be blacks against whites, it'd be black against black and white against white. But the argument against letting blacks fight for the Confederacy in the South can be boiled down to the fact that the whole idea of this quote unquote revolution is to show the inferiority and to sustain the inferiority of black people. There was a gentleman from Georgia named Howell Cobb, who was a member of the US Congress, who put it this way. He was saying that if we let them fight and they fight bravely and well, it would disprove all the theories and notions that we have about slavery. And therefore he was opposed to letting blacks fight because what they've been told themselves about black people in general may not be true. He did not want to find that out.
Yeah, that takes away a huge numbers advantage they had too.
Exactly. And so, but at the same time, though, the cause to have blacks fight for the Confederacy, as you point out, was a numbers game here. They could count. There are 30 million people in the United States, and the North had 20 million of them. And immigration that had been taking place over the decades, most people went to the North. Why? Because of the fact that they could get jobs up there. The South was slave dominated. You can't compete against a slave when they could work for free. So they went north. So the North had the numbers. The North had the factories. The North had education. The North had the industries to go ahead and really build a very good, great war machine. And the Confederacy just really didn't have much of anything except the hope that England would support them. So Confederate agents went off to England in the hope of getting recognition as an independent nation, thereby being able to get military help, have military alliances, and get money and food and weapons and also British troops. And remember, at this time, Canada was a part of England. So that would have put the United States pretty much fighting a two-front war, if possible. And then in 1862, September, at the Battle of Antietam. And this may well have been the turning point of the war politically. You got Robert E. Lee, who frankly made his reputation as a great general against George McClellan, who was one of the worst generals in American history. McClellan was a guy who tended to freeze in battle. He was afraid to use the advantages that he had. McClellan at Antietam probably had about a 30 to 40,000 man advantage, but had convinced himself it was the other way around. And when his staff advised him to send in his reserves, we can crush Robert E. Lee today. We can crush them, send your reserves. McClellan refused to do that.
Wasn't McClellan like theoretically going to be a good general just based off his merits and his educational background?
McClellan?
Yeah.
Well, McClellan finished second in his class at West Point. He was a smart guy. I mean, he went to West Point when he was 16 years old. He was brilliant, in my opinion. The problem though, he just wasn't much of a leader. He was great at building the military. He built the Union Army. He trained the Union Army. And the Union Army, by the end of the war, was the best army in the world. Mm-hmm. And McClellan was responsible for that. It was just that he did not know how to lead it. He was intimidated by Robert E. Lee, Bobby Lee, as Union troops called him, and with respect, I should point out. And McClellan was a guy, again, he tended to freeze. And he was constantly, he could constantly play the victim. He was, any time he lost a battle, which was quite frequent, especially if Lee was the opponent, McClellan would Lincoln. Well, Lincoln did not give me supplies I needed. He did not give me the men that I needed. I'm outnumbered 2-1 when actually he may have had a 2-1 advantage. This frustrated Lincoln to no end. He said at one point, Lincoln says on the lines of, well, if he had 1 million, he swore the enemy would have 2 million. And if I gave another 1 million, he swore the enemy had 4. And when McClellan refused to make moves to go against Robert E. Lee, at one point, Lincoln plaintively asked, well, if you're not going to use the army, can I borrow it? And so, so he was definitely frustrated with McClellan. McClellan, for his part, did not respect Lincoln at all. So the Battle of Antietam came about, and the reason why this battle is so important politically is because of the fact that the Confederacy was trying to gain recognition from England and France as an independent nation. And Lincoln, meanwhile, has people over there trying to prevent that from happening. And so the problem here was that England around 1833 had abolished slavery in England and its colonies. And at the same time, the British Navy was doing its best to try to end slavery, period. They would board ships with suspected slaves. The one country that would not allow the British to board its ship was the United States. And so countries that had contraband slaves on board would fly the American flag.
Right. And so this is what, so I might be jumping the gun here, but this is the battle after which, technically the Confederacy withdrew. So technically it was a Union victory. This is when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation and essentially eliminated any type of outside foreign help, right?
Antietam, that was the Battle of Antietam. Okay. Because what was happening here was the fact that the British were waiting for Lincoln to say this was a war to end slavery, and Lincoln would not do it. Well, if you're England, and the Americans are not going to abolish slavery, at least, verbally say this is a war to end slavery, then what is in England's best interest? The best interest is for a Confederate victory, because the United States was getting too big. The British saw the size of this country. They saw this country probably had seemingly unlimited material and minerals and resources. And so if the Confederates win, this country split in two, where, all of a sudden now that's England's advantage. Also, the British were trying to do what they could to convince Lincoln to end the war. This is something that was a popular belief at that time. The South is too big to conquer. There's too much space there. You can't conquer the entire South. It's hopeless. Give it up. You had members of Parliament, therefore, who certainly wanted a Confederate victory, not only because it would split the United States in two, but also, that is, you lose half your territory, but also England was a country in which the lower class had basically very few rights. If you were a lower class white man or woman in England, you could not move up to a higher class. You were a peasant. You didn't have the right to vote. There are other restrictions as well on your citizenship. So the upper class in England kind of looked at this as something in which psychologically a Confederate victory would be a victory for them. Whereas at the same time, England's lower class, this peasant class, sympathized with the slaves. So they're hoping for a northern victory, a Union victory. So this is a war in which England's cultural wars, essentially, or cultural battles being fought in the battlefields of America. And so, and certainly the upper class feared that a Union victory would encourage the lower class in England to now start demanding their own rights, particularly if the slaves in America were freed. So all this is taking place. And then one other thing is taking place. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, was leaning toward backing the Confederacy and recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. And then he was about to make this announcement, apparently, where he was about to go ahead and give recognition, when he found out that Robert E. Lee was invading the North. So he decided to hold off on anything until after, when Lee defeats McClellan and the invasion of the North is successful. Okay, then we'll recognize the Confederacy. So the Battle of Antietam lasted 3 days. And on the third day, McClellan, who had a chance to crush Lee, did not do so. Did not send his reserves. Lee slipped away, went back to Virginia. McClellan declared victory. Now, Lincoln, back in June or July of 1862, met with his cabinet and told them that he was decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And his cabinet was full of people who were in favor of ending slavery. But William Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State, and regarded, generally speaking, as the best Secretary of State in American history, advised Lincoln to not issue the Emancipation Proclamation right now. We're getting beaten the battlefield left and right, and it looked like an act of desperation. Wait till you win an important battle, and then you can issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, when Lee slipped away and McClellan declared victory, Lincoln felt that was enough to go ahead and issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, there is a misunderstanding of what the Emancipation Proclamation is all about. A lot of people felt that it freed the slaves. In fact, it did not really free the slaves. Many slaves as far away as Texas didn't even know about the Emancipation Proclamation until, much later, hence the celebration of Juneteenth, when they found out about it. It was not until June they found out about this Emancipation Proclamation. But basically, what it came down to is this. Emancipation Proclamation basically states that it's a foreign policy document as well as domestic document. And it states, it is addressed to the Confederate States. If you stop fighting against us by January 1st, 1863, when this war is over, you can keep your slaves. But if you continue to fight against us after January 1st, 1863, this war is over, there'll be no more slavery in your state. Now, Lincoln couched it in that way because you had several border states that were slave states that were loyal to the Union. You had Missouri, you had Kentucky, you had Maryland, you had Delaware, and you had the western part of Virginia, now known as West Virginia. They all remained loyal to the Union, even though they were all slave states. So, and Lincoln had to do that because, frankly, if you said this was a war to end slavery, or if this was we're freeing all the slaves, we would have lost those border states to the Confederacy. So this was basically couched in terms of addressing the states in rebellion, as Lincoln referred to it. Okay, so that was the domestic part of it. The foreign policy part of this whole thing was aimed at England. This is not because Lincoln's basically saying now, this is where we're ending slavery. We're going to end slavery, and so you in England and France cannot, in good conscience, now back the Confederacy, recognize the Confederacy, in order to get what you want, because now you come across as hypocrites.
Right. So it was a ultimatum for the South in order to keep the Union together, which is what Abraham Lincoln really cared about in the first place, and it was internationally or foreign wise a moral statement that took away the threat of foreign aid from.
Well, not foreign aid, but yeah. You're right about that. You're right about that, and that was basically dealing with the whole notion of recognition. But it was not really a thing that you mentioned to the South. It wasn't really quite that, as much as because Lincoln knew that they were not. It's not an ultimatum, because Lincoln knew they were not going to stop fighting. It was more along the lines of letting everybody know that this is a war to end slavery. It was a sly way of doing it,
right?
While still at the same time keeping the support of those border states that were loyal to the Union. So it was a very clever document. So January 1st, 1863 came about, and people waited and they waited and they waited. Okay, is Lincoln going to sign this thing or not? And eventually in the afternoon, it came out that he did sign it. So Emancipation Day, January 1st, 1863. People celebrated. All right. Did it free any slaves? Well, not really, but certainly put the war on a slave footing. And in fact, slaves, we find out about it, did try to escape in increasing numbers. One of the funny things about this whole thing was the fact that Benjamin Butler was a general who was a guy who was not the most trustworthy person in the world. He was a Union general. And Butler, though, down in Louisiana, did some things that are quite controversial. He felt that Southern women should be viewed as prostitutes, for example. But there's another thing, too, in all of this, because it raised the ire of the gentleman in the South. But he also was a person who decided that against Lincoln's orders, I'm not returning slaves. If slaves, they're contraband of war. And and by returning slaves, you're helping the enemy. And so Butler kept them. And when a Confederate officer went to him and suggested that, well, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, they're slaves, therefore they must be returned to slavery, Butler pointed out, he was great at this, and says, look, you're the ones who say you're a separate country. Therefore, the Fugitive Slave Act does not apply. And so those are some of the controversies and issues that came about. Now, the other battle, really, that I want to touch on is Gettysburg. Whereas Antietam was a political battle, Gettysburg, political turning point. Gettysburg is a military turning point, because even after Antietam, the Confederacy still won most of the battles. The Union's problem was that, you had McClellan, you had Hooker, you had McDowell and others who, frankly, were not Robert E. Lee's equal. And it was not until you got Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the Army of the Potomac, where Lee finally met up with somebody who not only had the smarts to deal with him, like some of the others actually probably did, but he had the courage to deal with him.
Yeah, but didn't Grant kind of fall out of the sky and right into the laps of the Union?
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. He was not even involved in the war at the beginning. He had basically retired and was in his, running his father-in-law's store in Illinois. He's from Ohio, but he was living in Illinois. His wife is from Illinois. And so, Grant was a middling student at West Point, but he volunteered to come back into the Union Army. McClellan, in his infinite wisdom, refused to acknowledge that and refused to accept Grant back to the military for whatever reason. And but Grant did finally get back in, and Lincoln just ran through people left and right. But Grant has, despite rumors of his drinking, and Grant did drink, but he never did drink when his wife was around, and he never did drink in battle. When he got bored, he would drink. But Grant, though, had developed a reputation, though, as being a pretty good general. And so Lincoln, having had McClellan twice, and with negative results, and Hooker, Joe Hooker once said, when he took over as in charge of the Union Army, said, "May God have mercy on Bobby Lee, because I will have none."